I said that it's useful to see the IRA as part of a continuum of other industrial policy efforts, and that's true. Donald Trump, who now running for re-election, is trying to attack President Biden he's trying to turn this into an anti-worker law. His new phrase is that Joe Biden is waging war on American autos. So EVs have fewer parts. Does that mean we'll have fewer jobs for them? They tend to, at least now, those jobs tend to pay a little bit less. Will they lose wages? And the Republican political machine is trying to take advantage of those fears during the campaign. So you've got a lot of partisan bickering over the meaning of the law, even as all these projects start to pop up across the country. The IRA is not a trade bill. It's an industrial policy bill. And I think it's best to think about it not on its own, but as one of a series of industrial policy measures that the US Congress has taken during the Biden administration, starting with the bipartisan infrastructure law, moving on to the bipartisan Chips and Science Act, which, as you know, was about increasing domestic semiconductor production, and now the IRA. It's part of a whole broader movement, as you say, towards trying to revitalize American domestic productive capacity. And I think the trends that contribute to that got us to the IRA are really two things. The small trend is the Democratic Party's interest in the clean energy transition. And that's a very partisan, for better or worse, that's a very partisan motivation. So that's one trend. But the much bigger trend that got us all three of these bills is a deep fear about the deindustrialization of America, a deep concern. And the roots of that concern, one of them is the perception that deindustrialization has harmed American workers, whether by globalization and the offshoring of American industry and import competition, especially after China's admission to the WTO, whether it's because Wall Street increasingly is not interested in investing in like capital-intensive, high-risk projects. It's much easier to make money off a new app than a new factory. That at least that's been true. Business investment has been declining for the past few decades in the U.S. That's one cause that's been driving this kind of deindustrialization, and the perception is that has hurt workers. I'm sure many people in the audience will be familiar with the China shock work, the research that's been done on that, and deaths of despair, where you can actually map those areas and those industries that were most exposed to deindustrialization have this increase in social problems, suicides, drug overdoses, and so on. So that's one cause. The second cause is the rise of China, of course, and the fear that the United States will lose the technological race. And then lastly, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, really woke the whole world, but also the American public up to the reality that fragile supply chains have high costs. And it's amazing, the awareness level among normal Americans, it's night and day. I don't think most people would have used the word supply chain in everyday language before the pandemic. Now we make jokes about it. You'll be out with friends, someone will say, "Hey, why aren't you married yet?" Oh, it's supply chain issues. You know? That's a radical shift in the public's attention to these issues. So you put all those together, and you've got this new interest in policy that directly revitalizes American industry. And both parties have had to pay attention to that. So you've got President Biden's version of that, but you also, that's how President Trump got elected in 2016, was by talking this way. Globalization has hurt American workers. Wall Street is not looking out for American workers. We need to bring manufacturing and industry back. And President Biden, of course, won talking in a very similar way. And that, I think, is to your point about the Republican Party, that's the war happening in the Republican Party right now between traditional pro-business Republicans and this newer wave in the wake of the Trump phenomenon that recognizes, wait a minute, American working class voters are very dissatisfied. They'll vote for Trump, they'll vote for Biden, but you have to talk that way if you want to win. And DC, as you know, is very responsive to political pressures. So I think that's the bigger context out of which the Inflation Reduction Act emerged, with the added component of the green transition and interest in clean energy. But that's the bigger context, I think. Right. The American public wants a change. They're very dissatisfied with the status quo. That's why someone like Trump could win. And it's important to remember, he didn't win the Republican primary closely. He won it by a huge margin. That's how, I think, fragile the establishment was and how ready at least the Republican voting base was for something new. And you saw something similar in the Democratic Party as well, with Bernie Sanders doing very well unexpectedly. And now President Biden has adopted much more of these kind of economically nationalist tones, this pro-industry kind of tone, this pro-worker tone. So both parties, I think, are responding to a hunger on the part of voters for something new. So I think yes. And when it comes to costs, I think there's a fundamental conversation happening in the U.S. about how to measure prosperity. Efficiency is the primary goal. Maximizing shareholder value on the firm level, maximizing GDP on the national level. These are the measures of prosperity. And I don't think average Americans believe that anymore. Because you can increase GDP and hollow out a whole region by deindustrialization at the same time.
Right.
And so there are other concerns beyond just maximizing GDP that I think the more politicians get savvy about talking that way, the better they do. And again, the last two elections, you think you saw that play out.
Right.
The trend line in the United States is to restrict investment flows to and from the United States and China. President Biden has done that on certain things, semiconductors, quantum AI. Trump in his campaign has indicated he wants to do that much more broadly, like no Chinese ownership of any critical infrastructure, farmland, energy, telecommunications, and so on. That's where the mind of both the president and the former president is. That's where and Congress's mind is as well. And so this question of like, okay, you see investment from China into Korean companies to get around the rules. Congress is paying very close attention to that, even when American companies do that. Never mind anyone else.
Right.
So I agree entirely with your caution that it's wise to be mindful of how much attention Congress and the president and the other presidential candidates are paying attention to who owns what, because they will not be fooled, and they do care about it quite a lot.